A dial can make a drastic difference in how a watch feels, how it functions, and when I first got into this hobby, the Omega Aqua Terra was right up there with the Rolex Explorer as a robust do-it-all watch for around $5,000 to $7,000. But I couldn't get behind the pattern or teak style dial. And that changed with the new Omega Aqua Terra and its new Black Lacquer Dial. We'll also discuss the new bracelet adjustment system as well. Now, I'm not saying this watch revolutionizes the Omega Aqua Terra line. It doesn't. The case is the same design with their lyre lugs, but they're now polished instead of brushed. So the tops and sides of each of these lugs is now polished. Now this has the same polished center link on the bracelet. It features white gold indices and hands. It's master chronometer certified. And the specs and the sizing for each case size is shown on the screen from the 34 to 38 to 41 millimeter sizes. The 41 millimeter that I have with me today does feature a different movement though. So the 41 features the 8900 movement, whereas the 38 and 34 carry the 8800 movement. Each of those with 55-hour power reserve, and this has 60-hour power reserve. Now the 38 does come with a 19 millimeter lug width, which a lot of people may not like. Now this 41 millimeter version does come in at 149.4 grams with all the links attached. So in the era of CNC bracelets, it's nice to see something that's a little bit lighter with all the links in than something like the Submariner, for example, in the same sizing at 41 millimeters. Now this 41 millimeter variant on my 6.75 inch or 17 centimeter circumference wrist does wear really nicely. The weight's distributed evenly. It feels relatively thin in the fact that it spreads out its space over the entire area of the top area of my wrist. It doesn't feel too top heavy. The bracelet starts at 20 millimeters and tapers down to 17 millimeters at the clasp. The 38 might wear better for many people and even for myself, but I couldn't get my hands on the 38, only the 41. Now, as a shout out, thanks to Exquisite Timepieces and Ethan in Naples, Florida for letting me get my hands on with this watch. I know they could sell it tomorrow, but they were kind enough to let me see it first before it got sold. So if you're in the Florida area or you're shopping online, check them out. Now this is a butterfly style clasp, and there's no real way to adjust a butterfly style clasp because you can't adjust it one direction. You have to adjust one in compensation next to the other. Now there's a button on one side of the clasp where you can press and slide a pivot point that slides that part where it pivots of the clasp over. When you move it to the normal position, the clasp closes nice and tight, exactly what you'd expect from a butterfly style clasp. Alternatively, you can change a pivot point to another setting rather than normal, where it widens the bracelet overall by 2 millimeters. When you close the clasp, however, you do see this 2 millimeter gap staring right back at you. Now, I don't necessarily like it. I don't think it's the end of the world, but I don't really like it at all. I'm not sure if it would have been possible to change the entire Omega Aqua Terra line over to a single-sided clasp and to engineer something a bit stronger or a bit more useful than this. It seems to me like they're trying to take their existing bracelet design and clasp designs and smack on some sort of adjustment system, which makes sense from a business standpoint and a cost standpoint. But from a practical standpoint, it kind of makes it useless or very not useful. 2 millimeters for me is not enough adjustment to actually notice that much of a difference in comfortability. And on this glide lock, I tend to alternate between 4 different positions, which means that this will never be perfectly fit. Just like they did with the Speedmaster's tiny bracelet adjustment system, they're trying to add something. And I don't know if it's better to not add anything at all than to add something like this, because it's just frankly quite not enough. And it's not the most attractive look on a watch that costs this amount of money. You would expect it to look nice as a finished product in either version of the bracelet. Worse, after widening the bracelet, the clasp didn't want to return to the normal position, so I would try to return it to the normal position, but it wouldn't lock in place, and I had it accidentally widen on me several times while I was trying to put it on. Now, the Glide Lock clasp on Rolex, or even the Teed Fit clasp we find in Tudor, are substantially more useful and enjoyable without the same sort of issues. There were other questions you guys asked me on Instagram, so find me there at Harrison Elmore if you have any questions. I tend to ask them before I do a review. For example, my next review is gonna be on this Citizen here. I'm about to ask everyone if they have questions for that. So rapid fire questions. Does it wear like the 13 millimeter thickness implies? Yes and no. My Submariner here is about 12.5 millimeters thick, and this feels about the same for the size. It feels thin on a 41 millimeter version because it's so wide. The dimension of thickness seems to fit it, whereas a 38 millimeter version on the same thickness might feel a bit tubby. How dressy is this compared to the Explorer? I would say very. Now the Explorer I think can be subdued just because it has a lot more brushed surfaces and it isn't quite as loud in terms of the indice layout as being as dressy. This definitely looks like you're wearing a nice watch. And I think that anytime you put on this Aqua Terra with the way the indices are laid out and the fact that everything's polished and the polished center links, it's gonna look like a dressy watch regardless. So I guess it depends on how dressy you are as a person and which you would prefer for either of those scenarios. What is a lacquer dial? A lacquer dial is basically just paint. They do multiple different layers of colored varnish sprayed onto the dial to make it look like this. It's the same thing you'll find on a lot of watches, especially a lot of Rolex watches. It's highly reflective, it's an even surface, and I think it adds a lot of depth when it's done in black. It's something I've always loved on Rolex watches, which I'll cover a little bit later. And is the bracelet compatible to old Aqua Terra lines? I would imagine yes. They'd have to redo the entire lugs in terms of where they were drilled, as well as the overall shape. And I don't think that that's probably going to happen. So it probably is compatible just like the Speedmaster. It's easier to do it that way. Some people won't like the dial changes. It seems too similar to the competitor Rolex's dial types. Whereas Omega has had patterns with their teak dials on their Seamasters and Aqua Terras for a long time now. That pattern was a differentiator. Others will see the move as a welcome addition as it puts it right in line to compete with the Explorer from Rolex. When I was shopping for my first luxury watch, versatility was really important to me. The Explorer seemed to be inevitable, and I chose this because the alternative was a dive watch. If you wanted something without a rotating bezel or an external rotating bezel with good water resistance and it was relatively versatile, the Aqua Terra and the Explorer are definitely in that landing. But the Aqua Terra always had that teak dial, and I thought it didn't traverse the same sort of versatility as the Explorer did, which is why I chose the Explorer. But this with the new black dial, I think makes it a very strong competitor for a lot of people. So let's go into what I like and what I don't like. What I like is the new dial. It's something I've always loved about my Explorer, and especially the Submariner here, where the black lacquer I think is deep, it's rich, it's reflective in just the right ways. If you've seen a dial like this in person, it just looks very cool. There's something special, I think, about a black reflective lacquer dial. It might even surprise you in how much you like it, even though it looks kind of standard in the press images. I love the anti-reflective coating. It gives you a better look of the indices and logo that you don't get on something like the Explorer or a lot of other watches. It gives you a better view, I think. Now the downside is if that anti-reflective coating is on the top, you could potentially scratch it and then you'll be able to see those scratches. I like the indices, the shape and design of those indices, because it looks rich, it looks refined, it looks neat. It looks frankly better than you find on the standard indices of Rolex models. I love the jumping hour hand added to the watch because it's just functional. It's a lot easier. Setting the date is a little bit harder, but setting the time when you're switching time zones is really nice. So I really like the jumping hour hand. The pointed arrow minute hand is something all Aqua Terras have that I really enjoy because it makes it that much more legible. The date complication at 6 and the window that they use to design it, I think is also a nice addition. I think it's functional, useful, legible. It's all the things that I like in a watch. The sizing I think is really nice as well. The 41mm size fits me really well. And the bracelet taper and design is really nice with the adjustment as like an added thing that we'll talk about. The movement, while master chronometer certification doesn't wow me, given the tests are very achievable with the accuracy, consistency, and repeatability that is designed around creating a silicone hairspring and the added amagnetic properties that go along with that, the movement still is attractive and a well-built top-grade movement. But there are still things that I don't like. Right? There's so much polishing. The polished center links, while attractive, are large and they smudge and eventually will scratch very easily. I held this for a very short, limited amount of time and already had smudges all over the bracelet. The polished bezel here, I think, would look better set against brushed tops to these lugs rather than polished because you'd see more contrast. And I think the fact that they're all brushed, it's harder to see the differentiation between the side of the lug and the top of the lug, which is part of why lyre lugs look so cool. So the fact that everything's polished, I think, diminishes the noticeability of the design around these lugs. It also makes it a scratch magnet like crazy, which doesn't fit me. I scratch everything, and that I don't like. The lack of white paint, in the images, it doesn't seem to be that much of a problem, but in person, I find this less legible than something like the Explorer or the Submariner, just because the paint is relatively minimal given the size of each of those logos and each of those indices. And so you don't necessarily see it as easy. It's the same thing I see on my Speedmaster. It's hard to notice the logo because it's just applied and not painted. And so sometimes that Omega logo itself will kind of vanish a little bit in different lighting. And that is a downside with these indices where the paint I notice, but the indice is much larger than just the amount of paint that's on there. And so I think that could be a potential downside is overall legibility, but you'd have to try it on to see how much you like or don't like that compared to other things. That being said, the indices still look great. The onion style crown isn't the easiest to grab and pull out. I think it's fine, but the knurling is a little bit passive for me. Maybe I just have chunky fingers. I do kind of prefer something a little bit grippier. The adjustment system, while on the fly adjustment system is something that I use on my Submariner all the time, far more than I ever expected. It's not the end of the world if a watch doesn't have it. Even on a normal clasp like my Explorer here, you can buy a keychain spring bar tool or use a toothpick to change the positioning of the pin anytime you want. The adjustment system on here just lacks the ability to change range that much that I would prefer it, frankly, not be there because the way that it looks in the end is not worth it to me to really have it as an addition. As it stands now, also the butterfly clasp covers the entire bottom side of my wrist. So that is also a negative. You need to size it to make sure you get the correct number of links on each side. People complain a lot about the Submariner clasp size or the Tudor Pelago size of the clasp. This is the same problem. Even though it's hidden, you still feel it. And whether or not it's too far one way or the other is a big problem. In the end, the dial choice is a lot more conventional. It'll appeal to a lot of people. I think it'll become the main model for the Aqua Terra line because, let's face it, the standard looking dials sell watches. Now that being said, given the amount of polishing and the bracelet adjustment system, I think it isn't worth really selling your Aqua Terra for something like this, and I don't know that it's that much of a value proposition for people to choose this versus something like even a vintage Explorer, in my opinion. Now, if you want more of a dressy aesthetic, this is definitely your move. But if it wasn't for the amount of competitors out there, if you're really looking for a dressy look, I probably would go for something like a Grand Seiko here for the same amount of money. This is $6,600 and this is somewhere around the same price. And I think the Grand Seiko, while leaning even more into that dressy aesthetic, I think looks nicer. So I guess it depends. Are you someone who leans more Explorer, someone who leans more Grand Seiko, or someone in between who's looking at the Omega Aqua Terra? But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.